Good morning, everybody. This is John Haller. Well, it's good morning where I am. I'm here today with Robb Schwartz, my friend from Orange County, California, or Orange, California, I guess. Robb, maybe people aren't aware of who you are. So tell us who you are and why I might want to be talking to you on a recorded podcast. Make your case.
Yeah, well, John and I met. We met about a year, almost 2 years ago, I think it was, at a conference, and had a chance to get acquainted and quickly found out that we were both baseball fans and golfers. So that made a lot of sense. And of course, once you get into the Bible and you look at all of that, you begin to find out there's a lot of commonality here. But I've been out here in California all my life. Came to faith in 79, 80. Come from a Jewish background. I'm now leading a small Messianic Jewish congregation out here in Orange. And so John and I travel in some of the same circles, the conferences, and some of the people that speak at these different conferences are common friends of ours, folks like, of course, we met Olivier, David Towle, and some of the other speakers as well, Tom Hughes, and so forth. And so we find a lot of common ground in our look at the scriptures, recognizing Israel's role in all of this, both ancient and modern day, the role of today's Jewish people, and when Jewish people come to faith, the importance of the prophecies that we all believe are right in front of us. When a Jewish person comes to faith, I've been saying this for years. I used to get real excited about it when I was younger, and now I begin to realize this is only meeting the minimum. So I got a C on the test when I came to faith. But the real joy I have in all of this is watching somebody of non-Jewish blood coming to faith and then recognizing the importance of both, of course, the Old Testament and the Jewish writings and all that, but also the importance of today's modern day Israel, which is pretty controversial. So that's
okay. Well, let's talk a little bit about this. I'm sure we're going to get to this. Robb sent me a copy of this book, The Secret War Against the Jews. And it's not like, it's a very thick book. You know, it's not easy, but and part of that, and I'm sure we'll talk about this. This was in response to a series of programs that came about on what I would call the anti-Jewish, anti-Israel media, like new media, especially on the what I call the woke right, like Candace Owens and Tucker Carlson. There was a series of programs. These things seem to run in cycles. So the Russians released the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which is a total fake, made up history of the Jews and that type of thing. It's just a propaganda piece. Probably back in the 1800s when the Tsars still ruled Russia.
Yeah.
And so this thing has a way of sort of recycling through. So you see it, Candace Owens is picking up on it, Tucker Carlson, other people on the woke right, that all of our problems relate to the Jews. The Jews have too much influence. The Jews own Congress. The Jews control everything. And my response to some of that sometimes too, Robb, is if you've ever driven in Jerusalem traffic, you know that the Jews don't control everything. I mean, that alone is like a refutation of that canard that people put out all the time. So let's talk, because this Israel thing is very big, and we were just talking beforehand about the relationship between the church and Israel and Romans 11 and all that, and I'm sure we'll get to a little bit of that. But let's just kind of talk about what you see going on right now in culture in the church relative to Israel.
Wow.
So we're recording this, by the way. This is being recorded on the morning of May 22nd, 2025.
Yeah, that is part of my life's work has been, since I came to faith, is recognizing the importance of the relationship. Where do the Jews fit in all this? Where do the Christians fit in all this? You know, get cut right to the chase. When Jesus returns, he's coming to Jerusalem. He's going to set up his kingdom in Jerusalem, and you can bet dollars to donuts that, or maybe dollars to matzah, I don't know what, but you can bet that he's going to be setting up a Jewish kingdom there, and that implies Jewish law and Jewish lifestyle and Jewish custom. I've got 2 books on my bookshelf, John. You may or may not be familiar with the writer Brad Young. He's a part of an organization that came out of Israel called the Jerusalem School of Synoptic Research. And they do a lot of research in converting the Greek version of the Gospels, which of course is what we have in our hands, and do some backwards translating into Hebrew. And they've discovered some interesting things through that. So Brad Young wrote a couple of books. One of them is called Jesus, the Jewish Theologian, and the other one is called Paul, the Jewish Theologian. And what's interesting is, I'm writing an article right now, which I'll have to get to you when I finish it. Every time Paul is making reference to his background, he never calls himself a Christian. He always says, I'm a member of the tribe of Benjamin, a Pharisee of Pharisees. He was, very tied into the Jewish leadership and Jewish structure. Paul never deviates from his cultural roots. And I think that's one of the things that I've discovered here is that it's okay for Jewish people. In fact, I think it's required for Jewish believers to remain who they are, embracing Jesus, because that's the fulfillment of all the scripture and all the prophecy. And then to the Gentile believer, when they deviate, like Candace Owens and Tucker Carlson and others have, they lose their roots. The foundation of the belief system is it could be anything at that point, and that's kind of a scary thing. Candace made a statement this morning about the shootings in D.C. that kind of the chickens were coming home to roost, so to speak. Not in those words, but the idea is because of what Israel has been doing over in Gaza and everything else, we're going to start seeing events like this on the street. I'm thinking, boy, that's a pretty hard statement to make.
She actually said that?
Something very similar to it. And it was included in, I think I may have sent it to you. If I didn't, I'll see if I can track it down. But the idea here is that when you begin to make statements along the lines of the Jews are not really favored and not chosen, and they have missed the mark, so to speak, you're treading on dangerous territory, especially when it comes to scripture. And that's one of the things that, like Olivier's ministry, stays on scripture constantly and reminds us of the importance of recognizing that tie-in between the Old and New Testaments, and then an ancient history to modern history. If you lose that thread, anything goes.
Well, there's a lot to unpack there. So let's.
Let me ask you something, John.
Sure.
When you brought the book up, I'm glad you did. I was wondering if you were going to bring it up. That was great. Let's talk about why you got that book in your hands in the first place.
Okay, let's go there.
What prompted it? Do you remember the original conversation?
Well, it was about the USS Liberty, I believe.
Yes.
Right. So this book is like an encyclopedia. And by the way, I did a conference with Mike Spalding and some other people this year. And then Mike does a couple conferences a year, usually over in Brookville, Ohio. It says Brookville, Ohio, but it's way out in the middle of nowhere country at a church. And I had never met Derek Gilbert. So, but we've communicated for years. So he was speaking at one of Mike's conferences last year. So I had a little bit of time. So I just drove over to hear him. And I will say this, Derek gave a phenomenal talk about, I don't remember what it was about. It was sort of like the fake history of Israel, the real history of Israel, and all the fake stuff that's been made up. And it was a phenomenal talk. And so you can find that on Derek Gilbert's, on his social media, on YouTube. I can't remember which channel it's on. If I remember, I'll put a link in the show notes. But I think a lot of that was based on this book. At least that was one of the source materials that he used. So one of the things that continually comes up among Tucker Carlson and the woke right and everything is this thing about the USS Liberty. So tell us about the USS Liberty, the theory, how it's used, and then what the truth is.
As best as I can, from what I've read, the USS Liberty was an American intelligence ship that was floating off the coast of Israel during the Six-Day War in 1967. And as the ship was out there, so the first or second day of the war, the Israelis discovered something, that their battlefield communications, this is according to the book, were being compromised by the American intelligence ship. And the Liberty, the crew, and there's a lot of background to this, the crew was taking that information, intercepting it, and then sending it to the British intelligence services on the island of Cyprus, who were then taking the decoded information there, the traffic and so forth, from the battlefield commanders, and they were transferring it to the Arabs during the war. Therefore, they were compromising their allies. The United States was compromising their Israeli allies. That's a very short version of the story. Candace Owens picked up the story and had a survivor from the USS Liberty, because the Israelis eventually attacked the ship, and with the intent of knocking out their communications gear, which they did. This lone survivor, well, there were many survivors, of course, but this survivor, almost 60 years later, 58 years later now, is telling the story of what his experience was on the Liberty. And as it turns out, every detail that he puts into his commentary on Candace's show matched exactly what was in the book. And the point was that he understood what had happened, which meant that the Israelis did indeed attack the USS Liberty. The American flag indeed was very visible. That's come up as an issue, saying it was a case of misidentification, which it was not. The American flag was very clear. The Israelis knew exactly what they were doing. But the problem is the people on the Liberty, which had intelligence apparatus on the ship, it had NSA, National intelligence folks on the ship, actually commanding the ship. They were not aware of why Israel was doing what it did. And as soon as the attack happened, the Sixth Fleet out in the Mediterranean began to respond. And both Secretary Robert McNamara, Secretary of Defense, and President Johnson pulled back the fighters that were actually going to go in and defend the Liberty, which of course you would expect it to happen. And at that point in time, the cover-up story started. So the books, the story about the USS Liberty, within the book, it's one of the chapters, plus the corresponding notes, gives the Israeli side of the story, which has not been told very much. The book came out 30 years ago. And when Candace published this particular story just a couple of months ago, it got more than 5 million views. I went back into the book and looked at the account that the writers wrote, Loftus and I can't remember the second writer's name, and they matched the video 100%. So I'm challenging anybody that watches that video, get a hold of the book and read the account of the USS Liberty and look at the side that Israel is, the side that the writers wrote to tell the story, the side of Israel, and what decisions they had to make and in what sequence they had to make the decisions. So I think that was
and by the way, too, Rick Wiles in his what has become an anti-Semitic cesspool channel, True News, also did a big video on the USS Liberty a few years ago. And what Candace did, Candace kind of reminds you of the person, and I heard somebody once talking about somebody who was well known in apologetic circles, but clearly heretical in their belief. And the person said, well, what the guy shares is both good and original, but the good stuff isn't original and the original stuff isn't good. So Candace is just parroting things that she's read. These, it seems like she was praising one day how great Wikipedia is. But you have something from Wikipedia that relates to what's in the secret war against the Jews,
yes,
and kind of tie that into this USS Liberty story.
So if you look at the Liberty as an intelligence ship, this young sailor he's now in his 70s, he said that when he got onto the Liberty, he saw all of the intelligence gear. They call it the apparatus or whatever they call it, the array, the intelligence array. He said, what is this ship doing? And the answer back to him from his fellow sailors was, oh, we're mapping the ocean floor. So, he goes overseas. The ship takes on some new personnel, I think it was in Spain, that turned out to be 3 non-Jewish Hebrew translators. So they had intent when they sailed into the Mediterranean at that time. Well, as it turns out, that term about mapping the ocean floor, he quickly figured out, with all of the intelligence apparatus pointing to the sky, they weren't mapping the ocean floor. Now, it turns out about 6 to 8 months later, I can't remember exactly when it was, could have been in late 1967, which is when the Liberty was attacked. The USS Pueblo, another American intelligence ship, was floating off the waters of North Korea. And the North Koreans recognized it for what it was, and they surrounded the ship and commandeered the ship and took it over. Commander Lloyd Bucher, I think it was, they had, I think, 80 plus sailors on board. They tried to scuttle the ship and destroy all the intelligence equipment. What is interesting in the Wikipedia about the USS Pueblo is there were, at least as of a couple months ago, because these things change with editors, there was a statement in that Wikipedia dealing with the intelligence array on the ship, and that the ship had been originally, it was targeting, or I should say, sweeping intelligence, I guess, from the bottom of the ocean. It was the same story, that they were studying the ocean floor, as the story that the USS Liberty was told to by that the sailor had talked about during the Candace Owens interview. So I thought that was a very interesting connection. And when you look at it, within 6 months, 2 American intelligence ships operating in foreign waters, both claiming they were in international waters, were both attacked by foreign sources. In one case, it was an enemy, North Korea. In the other case, it was an ally, which is Israel. And in both cases, of course, it was during President Johnson's administration in late 1967, early 1968. So there's a lot to be said for these 2 stories. And I think in some fashion, we need to see them together to understand the full context of American intelligence. Just something to...
Yeah. So a lot of, again, this is just kind of it's just part of the propaganda against the Jews, is that people take a bits and slices of a story and then never, they don't tell the whole story. I mean, this is pretty common. And, it's why we have, in our legal system, we have an adversarial system, which I know very well because I was a trial lawyer for, I got my law license 45 years ago. So I've been around, tried a lot of cases and everything. And if you're not the plaintiff in a case, or the person who goes first, you always have to tell the jury, you got to wait till you hear the whole story. And what Candace is very good at is just telling a little bit of the story. And so then you see Tucker Carlson. Tucker Carlson has on this guy named Gunther Isaac. Are you familiar? I'm sure you're familiar with him from Christ at the Checkpoint.
Right.
And well, just tell us what you know about Gunther and how Tucker used him, or how he used Tucker, maybe is a better way.
Yeah, I don't know the whole story, but I do know that Christ at the Checkpoint is a group that meets from time to time in Israel. I think Bethlehem, if I'm not mistaken. And Tucker, for some reason or another, fell under this guy's influence, and he has I get Tucker. I like him. I mean, we all love Tucker, all the work he did on Fox over the years and all of that. And he's been a very clear voice, but he doesn't quite understand the role of the Jews, Israel, and within the context of, I'll call it Christianity. That's another discussion, John, we could have these days. But this guy influenced Tucker's thinking. And now Tucker came out of that. He didn't have a chance to talk to any of the, well, of course, it's long past now that Chuck Smith is gone and Chuck Missler's are gone. But there's a lot of really good Christian apologists out there that are, they understand the role of Israel and the Jewish people, and they recognize and they teach it accordingly. And it's understandable that you hear something the first time, you think that's the truth. But, John, like you said, you got to hear the whole story. When I read this account of the Liberty in the book that John mentioned here, The Secret War Against the Jews, I was stunned to find out that it was published 30 years ago. And I bought the book a number of years ago, read the story, and I thought, wow, this has not been told. Nobody knows this part of the story. What even became more interesting is when Candace did the interview, I went right back to the book and I read the chapter on the Liberty. But there's another chapter, or not a chapter, but what these two writers do is their documentation. So I went back into the documentation section that supported their chapter. And I did not know this, but the United States had a nuclear submarine, a nuclear powered submarine or nuclear capable submarine floating under the Liberty. The USS Andrew Jackson, apparently, if the story is correct. And if you look at those notes, John, you'll find you probably have already looked at them, but you might want to review them if you have a chance, because it's amazing to see what else was going on during that incident. And here we are 58 years later, and we're coming up to the anniversary on June 6th, the 6-Day War. And that story is going to come up again this year. You can bet on it, especially for the Israel haters. They're going to glom onto the story. The sad thing is that the other side of the story, Israel's side, has not been widely distributed within Christian circles, especially within Christian circles that love the Jewish people and want to help. And I think this is the kind of a thing that would be a big, big step in the right direction. So maybe one or two people, or hundreds, or maybe even thousands watching the show today will have a chance to go order the book and then review the other side of the story. As you said, John, I like it. There's always another side.
Yeah, I mean, this is the case, and so just let me flesh out a little bit more about Munther Isaac. I've been to Christ at the Checkpoint, at least one of them, and I've met Munther. I've met all the people involved with this, and I don't know how else to say this in a kind fashion without just being very bluntly truthful about it. They're pro-Palestinian, they're Marxist, liberation theologians.
Yeah.
They have a very much of an affinity with the most recent Pope that just passed away, Pope Francis, who was also a liberation theologian first, and the Christianity thing went way down the line. And so that's why, you'll see this common elements between what Francis did when he was in Israel in 2014. He did a mass in Manger Square outside the Church of the Nativity, and there's a big mural behind the altar that they erected there for this mass, and it had the nativity scene in the liberation theologian motif. The three wise men were Popes John Paul II, Pope Paul VI, and Pope John the 23rd, who did the one of them was involved with Vatican II, the big Vatican Council back in the 60s. When I was alive, I don't know if you were alive then or not, but it changed the Catholic Church quite a bit. And then Mary was in a burqa. Joseph was wearing a Palestinian keffiyeh, and then the baby Jesus was in a manger wrapped in a Palestinian keffiyeh, because the theory is Jesus was a Palestinian refugee, and it's all complete nonsense. It's a complete reworking of the thing. And so then Munther Isaac came out with a similar theme right after October 7th. He had the baby Jesus in the rubble. It was Jesus in the manger in the Palestinian keffiyeh, with the manger sitting in rubble, which represented Gaza.
Yeah. The storytellers in this world are maybe going to be held to a higher standard when the time comes for judgment. And John, you've been in court. I've never been in court. Really want to avoid court. Don't want to be part of that. But you got to get your story right. And I try not to, what's the word I'm looking for here? Rely on any one source. I like to look at a number of different sources to make sure I have kind of a triangulation of what I'm trying to say in any particular, whether it's a sermon that I'm doing or some kind of a talk at a conference or something. And so this man and this narrative, or these people and their narrative, is going to be tested hard because the truth will come out. And you can see, I think today, even with the shootings in DC, the comment, I'm trying to remember who made it today, was that October 7th was an event, but today was a continuation. And so this has been a narrative that started after that. The war started on the 7th of October. And these people that are in the streets, like at Columbia University, again, another demonstration yesterday, a shooting on the streets of DC, where's it going to end? Where are we going to see a point where the authorities go, this is enough, this is where the line is drawn? I know that President Trump and Pam Bondi are doing what they can. I just don't know if it's too late. And that's something that we're going to have to determine as time goes on.
Well, that's kind of interesting. And so I will say this. There's a lot of thinking that Trump's going to come in office. We're going to get the Epstein files. We're going to get this file. We're going to get these files. And I just don't think people understand that the Attorney General has legal, ethical obligations that she has to follow, the rules of conduct that apply to her and apply to her as a lawyer and a prosecutor and that sort of thing that really kind of go beyond the Constitution. And for example, the Epstein files. My understanding is, at least from the reports I've been able to dig out, is that there's something like 14 terabytes of information there about, including videos and that type of thing, in the Epstein files. If you're going to prosecute those, you can't throw everything out there in the public. That's just a huge mistake. But I also know when you have vast amounts of information like that, I'll use just one case that I was involved in for many years. I'm still have been involved in it in one form or another for 25 years. Okay. So well over half of my legal career. But, we had a big case. The case went out. I should put myself up here so people can see that I'm actually participating in this conversation. So there were somewhere around 39 million pages of documents in addition to pages, actual physical pages, and then lots of emails and that type of thing. But this occurred 25 years ago, so email was not as extensive as it is now. But even in that case, where the government had at various times 50 or 60 people working full time on putting a case together against the people in this company, it took them 3.5 years to come up with an indictment. So I know there's a lot of, they're just hiding everything like they were before. Maybe they are. I don't know. I think it's too early to say, but it's very difficult to unpack all of this information in a very short period of time. And now you layer on top of it the things that we've learned about President Biden from the last few days, that he was incompetent, but and so it's not so much what he did, but it was the people around him that did the fraud that they did and the things that may have done that they shouldn't have done. But that's going to take a while to unpack. That's not going to happen overnight. So I see people on my side of the political ledger putting these incredible burdens on the people there. And maybe they're bought off. Maybe they are. I don't know. But, a lot of what was said is based on speculation, and these sex abuse cases are very difficult to put together. You got to find a victim, and if they're in these videos, you have to protect their privacy and that type of thing. So you just can't throw it out there on the internet. It's not ethical. It's not right, and it violates their rights too. Victims have rights as well. So I don't know if we'll ever know the whole story on this. And of course, everybody will say, well, if it doesn't come out the way I want it to come out, then it's a big cover up.
It's a conspiracy. I try to balance my conspiracy theories. I'm old enough to remember the day that John Kennedy was killed. And I remember I was in 6th grade. I remember when they knocked on the door of the room, and we put the TV. We were watching Spanish language TV out here in California, and so we watched the Walter Cronkite transmission, and then of course the announcement of the death. And I remember we got out of school 2:30, 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and I remember I got on my bicycle and I went down to the local. There was like a little deli liquor store that was about a half mile from the house, and I had a sense of history. So I took my dime out when you could buy a newspaper for a dime, and I dropped the dime into the newspaper rack, and they're meant for the LA Times. And I remember the Times, the front page had the font must have been 500 points. It was absolutely huge, big block text, Kennedy dead. So I bought the newspaper and I kept that front section up until even a few years ago when my daughter was in high school. And I sent her to class one day, her history class. I wanted her to share the newspaper story because I'd followed the assassination of Kennedy for many, many years. And it's the same thing, John. There are so many. It's like a hydra. It's got so many different arms to it. You don't know where it's going to end up and where the truth is. So, but I tell you what, you mentioned something about the Biden story here. We're only now beginning to understand the cover up. I got a little personal anecdote to add to this.
Sure.
I've got friends of mine all over the country that have been just like you. They're various fields of study and professions and all of that. But I called, I think, 3 or 4 of them after the election. And of course, it was still pretty raw because these folks are not on my side of the ledger when it comes to our politics. But I stayed in touch with them. And so I asked them one question: when did you know that Biden was compromised? And do you know what answer they gave me?
No.
The election, not the election, the debate. That was the day they recognized that Biden had a problem. Now, if you've been watching alternative news sources other than CNN, other than MSNBC, other than the big 3, CBS, ABC, and NBC, if you've been looking at anything else, you knew based on all kinds of evidence that Biden was having trouble. He couldn't do the job. He was falling down. He fell down on the bike. He fell on the stairs. None of that apparently was coming out in the mainstream media. And every one of my friends, one who's a PhD in pharmacology, another one a PhD in biochemistry, another one is a extremely deeply read and well-read, they were surprised and shocked. And then I asked them, what news sources are you watching? Every one of them said CNN. That was their go-to trusted news source.
And now Jake Tapper from CNN has come out with a book saying that Biden was incompetent when he was saying the exact opposite for years.
Did you see the Megyn Kelly interview this week?
I did. I saw part of it, yeah.
She just, it was good to see somebody held to the fire, and he kept dancing around it. It was like he was trying to apologize, and she wouldn't let him because that's what they did. The media protected Biden. I get having an opinion. Everybody's got an opinion, but at some point in time, you got to report what you see, and they weren't willing to do that.
Well, I heard a report last night that they had done a fake a town hall for Biden, and they recorded it. It was a couple hours, and what they were going to do was they're going to do this town hall, record it, then cut it up into campaign ads.
Yep.
And it was pretty clear, this is prior to the debate, that it was so bad, it was very, very bad. It was so bad that they couldn't use it.
Yeah.
And that was prior to the debate. So this was a massive cover-up. And then the question is, who was running it? Who was involved? Were there crimes committed? It certainly appears that there was at least fraud committed, whether it's prosecutable or not. I don't really know. That's not my.
Yeah. Are you following the Otto Penn story?
Yeah, I was just getting to that. I'm not optimistic that pardons will be overturned. That's kind of I think the Supreme Court is going to grant great deference in that particular area unless somebody can put things together.
Are you familiar with the name Lindy Lee?
Yes. I'm not so sure about her. When I see somebody come out like this so strong, I'm always a little bit skeptical in this day and age that I'm being steamrolled a little bit. You understand what I'm saying?
Completely. And I'll tell you, the only thing that makes me think that she's coming out with the truth, and we can get into her motivation. I mean, that's going to be another whole story, but she named the names behind the scenes that were moving everything around, moving Biden where he had to go and making the decisions that we didn't see, which basically said that the country was not being run by the president. And I think her value right now is talking about these individuals. She's naming names. And one of the individuals that she talked about was they were using Biden to get their agenda done. And it's kind of scary because I think of the history of, what's happened in time where you've got a ruler, but there's always that subordinate group of people that kind of seems to be the ones. Some people call it the deep state. I think Fletcher Prouty called it the secret team years ago when he was a little bit more visible, a guy that wrote a number of books years ago. And so she appeared on Patrick Ben David, and she also appeared on Sean Ryan's show. Right. And the story she told was consistent. And then, of course, you think about the names like Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who's got his own past, but he moved over towards Trump. The one that I'm really watching is Tulsi Gabbard. I think she's worth watching.
In terms of?
Well, in terms of experience, in terms of being a lifelong Democrat, and then suddenly she's beginning to see the party for what it was inside. That's the same. She's telling the same story that Lindy Lee did, and so I'm just kind of thinking to myself, what? And I have to admit, my journey. My parents were Roosevelt Democrats, Truman Democrats, Kennedy Democrats, Johnson Democrats. I mean, the whole thing. In fact, I've lost family members through this whole thing on both my dad and my mom's side that are diehard. I wouldn't even call them liberals. I would just call them, what used to be a liberal is not a liberal today. And I'm just amazed to see that it takes a huge risk career-wise, like Tulsi Gabbard and like Robert F. Kennedy Jr., to say, you know what, the party left me. I didn't leave the party, which were the exact same words that Ronald Reagan's been using for years. He was a former Democrat. So I'm not a lifelong conservative. I'll use the term, I came to faith, after I think I voted for George Bush. It was the first time I ever voted for a Republican.
Right.
It's a conversion process. It really is.
Right. I think that, I'm familiar with the Otto Penn story and Anita, what's her name? Anita Dunn, and how this is done. And I know a little bit about the pardons process in DC. I had some exposure to that in my legal career. I will just say on both sides of the political aisle, a lot of money will exchange hands between attorneys and campaigns and all this other stuff in the granting of pardons. It's not a totally pristine process. I don't want to come right out and say you can buy your pardon, but you can certainly grease the skids, I guess is the way to say that. There are whole law firms that they focus on getting pardons. These are well-connected attorneys, and some of them are people I've talked to on the phone, and you would recognize them. And so I'm not trying to interfere with their practice. They've worked hard to get those connections. But then, I'm just not sure that the whole process is above board. Although I will say that a lot of what Trump did was on the J6 and that type of thing, I think was pretty straightforward in pardoning all those people because I think of what I think were clearly abuses in the system.
One thing that I'm noticing about Trump's administration, and I'm looking at people like Marco Rubio, I'm looking at Pete Hegseth, I'm looking at Pam Bondi, I'm looking at all these guys, Tulsi and all that. He really has I think, an all-star cast. And I think these are generally really good people. I mean, there's nobody that's perfect, and there's going to be people that have a past, and that's going to come out. But I'm enjoying the fact that they're making an attempt to right the ship. And so I'm hoping as time goes on, this whole thing with the illegal gang members that are here. I mean, who wouldn't want to export and get rid of criminals and people that were here illegally? And I also understand that there's a lot of people here illegally that have contributed a lot to the country, and I wouldn't want them to leave. So it's a mixed bag, isn't it? I don't think there's anything where the battle lines are completely clean and clear in any situation. And so I'm just hoping that things will settle out in such a fashion that we'll see justice done, but at the same time, it's going to be met with mercy and grace, where mercy and grace need to be part of it.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. I just think so. Let's move on a little bit too. So we've covered the Civil War against the Jews, the USS Liberty. Certainly not in the detail. I mean, we could do our own. Maybe we should do our own documentary on that to respond to some of these ridiculous claims that are made. I mean, my view of it was. We always talk about we're a sovereign country and we can do things. So Israel's a sovereign country and it can do things too. And it should be given its right. And so they're in the midst of a war, and there's this ship that appears to be gathering intelligence. And so they do what any country in a war would do. And our guys were there. They did not, and I don't think, as you said, they didn't understand the mission. And so that's what led to it was sort of a cascade of problems and people not knowing the whole story. And still today, even after the whole story is exposed, people still use it for propaganda and political purposes. So let's talk about what happened in D.C. last night with the killing near the Jewish museum of a couple of Israeli people from the Israeli diplomatic corps in Washington, D.C., who were gunned down in cold blood on the street in Jerusalem. And the guy, as he's taken away to custody, is yelling "Free Palestine." Tell us what you know about that and what we think happened.
Somebody sent me the post, and I think, trying to remember, a friend of mine that lives in New York City sent it to me, I believe, early this morning, or maybe it was last night. So I went to bed last night knowing the story was out there. When I woke up this morning, I found out that these guys were believers. This men and women were believers, and they are tied into a ministry over in Israel called One for Israel. And so as the story kind of broke, it was interesting to see, when you're Jewish and you've accepted the Messiah, you become, and this is the interesting wrinkle to me in this whole story. You become, in a sense, they'll tell you you're not Jewish because you accepted the Messiah, that you've converted away from Judaism and all of that. But every report I've seen so far, including, from the condemnation, the statement that Netanyahu made, to a rabbi on the street that was interviewed last night, and there was a crazy guy in the back yelling and screaming and everything, and a couple of other releases I think it was Fox News did a story and somebody else did as well, that these people have not been identified as Messianic Jews or Christians or whatever. They've been identified as Jews. And that to me is important. Not that I'm playing at identity politics as much, but I'd like to see things right. And this kind of goes back, in my opinion, to the people that follow Jesus. They were all Jewish in the first century. And while that's a nice historical fact, what happens 2,000 years later if you're Jewish and you decide to accept the Messiah because of what history or what the Bible says or whatever it might be? And so I think it's important that we keep the truth up there. It doesn't have to we don't need to make it a separate story. It just needs to be integrated in the story to make sure it's accurate. And one of the things that I'm also waiting for, John, and I'm sure you are too, where are the Christians in all of this? Will Christian churches and Christian leaders, whoever they might be, including the Pope, for example, who's an American, is he going to come out and condemn the attack? Will we see Christian leaders in the various denominations come out and condemn the attack? I'm hoping that the Christians will come alongside the Jews and say, look, we're in this together. Because the Jews have, wherever they are, they're isolated. And we can see that what's happened in the college campuses. We can see it on the streets of the big cities. And so now it's time for, I think, the Christian community to make a statement. And I'm hoping to see it very, very soon.
Yeah, I'm waiting to see if I haven't seen where the Pope has done anything yet. So Christian leaders have come out and condemned it in different places around the country. At least this is what CBS is reporting. But you're right. One for Israel did release a statement that they were, both of these young lady and the gentleman he had apparently bought a ring this week and was planning to propose to her next week. I mean, this is just a horrific thing. And yeah, as you said, Candace has already been out there saying, well, this is what happens when you commit a genocide. And there's not a genocide taking place. That's very well known. We saw the UN this week come out. Yeah. One of the guys with the UN say that 14,000 babies would die in the next 2 days. And even the UN came and said the guy didn't have any basis to make that statement.
Right. But you know what? You're wearing a UN badge, you make the statement, it gets on the news, and therefore, and you know how this works, John. Once it's out there, you can never get it back. I don't care how many retractions that you issue. Once it's out there, and that's why it's critical, for us to get our facts right. I mean, I've been guilty of it. I mean, I'll see a source, one story, and I'll send it to friends, and all of a sudden we'll find out that it wasn't true, or it was a half truth. So we have to kind of take a step back, evaluate what we know, if we have more evidence. And as you know, John, scripturally even, it says a thing will be established in the mouths of 2 or 3 witnesses. So you want to have more than just one person pointing the finger.
But Rob, we've watched this over the past couple of days. I have a lot of friends in the UK. I was just talking on the phone with someone today from the UK. And there's severe distress in the UK about what they're doing vis-a-vis Israel. Their foreign, I don't know what the equivalent of our Secretary of State, David Lammy, was in Parliament the other day railing against Israel. And even the people opposed or that support Israel were like, oh, they got to stop this in Gaza. And I'm like, yeah, I agree they need to stop it in Gaza, but they need to stop it in Gaza. And I will get a lot of hate mail for this. Stop it when they're done. They're not done yet. They have not defeated Hamas. And I see all these statements, oh, they got to stop this. And I'm like, none of these people ever say free the hostages or Hamas surrender. Right. It seems like if Hamas surrendered and said we're gonna disband and here are the hostages and the bodies that we've been holding, just as kind of a negotiating ploy, then everything would change. But they don't do that, and nobody on the Candace Owen, Tucker Carlson, on the woke right, the Thomas Massey congressman from Kentucky, who I probably agree with 95% of his positions. Yep. But on Israel, he's wrong. He wants to focus. He said Israel controls everything in the U.S. media. By the way, do you remember the New York Times International Edition had a cartoon a couple years ago of Trump as a dachshund being on a leash with Netanyahu holding the leash? Do you remember that editorial cartoon?
I saw that. Yep.
Well, I'm just saying is that I see that all the time now across social media. My social media is filled with this garbage. And so look, I think that these people in DC were killed because they were Jews. They were associated with the Israel embassy. But if we don't think that this is coming for Christians as well, we're incredibly naive. And that's the problem with the narrative. Oh, we just need to stay here in America. We should stay out of the Middle East. We have, Israel's dragging us into war. No, I heard Mark Levin on Fox this morning. Mark's Jewish. And it was, I don't think I could get the volume level correct as to how he was saying it, but it was like, we're in a war. Just stop it. We're in a war. It's a war against the West. It's a war against the Christian Judeo-West.
Yeah.
And we need to understand that. And we need to talk about that. And personally, look, this will probably be, I was pretty hard on Trump in my update that I did this past Sunday. That's on our YouTube channel, because I thought what I saw go on in the Middle East there was a submission to Islam. And I'm all for peace, and I know the Abraham Accords and all this, but I also know the end of the book, and I know that this economic, this great economic prosperity and peace that Jared Kushner and Donald Trump are pushing, and this narrative and the Abraham Accords and all of this, be honest with you, I've said this to friends in Israel, Zionist Orthodox rabbi friends, it's a trap. Be careful. It sounds good, but you got to really dig into it, because ultimately we know what Islam is about. Rob, I don't know if you know this. I said this over the last couple of weeks in some interviews. We have this big war brewing between Pakistan and India. Mm. And India, by the way, has the largest number of Muslims in any one country in the world. It's 300 some million. There are Muslim countries that have, they're 99% Muslim, that are, like Indonesia has, in Malaysia, they have big, mostly Muslim populations, but they don't have 300 million. Like India does. And understand that in the Muslim invasions back in the Middle Ages, it's a little bit argued among historians, but I think the best estimate is that the Muslim invasions, the Muslims killed 400 million Indians in those invasions back in the Middle Ages. The largest genocide in history. Those weren't Christians, those were Hindus and Buddhists. And they were killed by the Muslims, the largest genocide in human history. And it's not really ever talked about. And we understand that this is what their holy scriptures say, and they're not going to distinguish between Christian and Jew at some point. Right now they have the convenience of Israel's being at war with them and actually taking the fight to them. But it's much broader than that. And I think we use a mistake. So listen, what I would do, I would take the plane that we got from Qatar. I'd take it out to a big open field and I'd blow it up.
I have another take.
Because that would make a statement.
Yeah, I have another take on this.
Or give it to my ministry, our ministry.
There you go. I've got another take on the trip from a couple of takes. Number one,
sure.
From a biblical perspective, I am not, and I'm going on the record here on John Haller's amazing show. I am not saying Trump is the Antichrist. I'm not saying that, but there's people that are talking about it. What I am saying is that this is a model for how the Antichrist is going to show up on the stage. He's going to make peace in Ukraine and Russia. He's going to reach out to India, Pakistan. He's going to reach out to the Middle East. These are only examples. And who knows where else these things are going to happen. What I'm saying is this guy, if Trump, you can look at Trump and you go, I could see how a person could move into this position and take that role and become that individual.
So here's what I suggested Sunday. So we're at this stage where Bible prophecies unfolding. Are you getting static in your?
I'm hearing some noises. I don't know if it was my dog.
Well, we're having work done at the house, so we're replacing some windows, so they're up there grinding away. So we may be picking up some of that. So I apologize. I should have told everybody up front.
Worries.
I'm trying to minimize those noises, but you got to. If I open the door to my office behind me, you wouldn't be able to hear us anyway. so it's very interesting when we live in this period of time, and you and I've talked about this. I talk about it at conferences, and we go back in the green room and we kind of talk about it too. So there's what I would call, and this is not meant to be denigrating towards anybody, but there's sort of the conventional wisdom on how these Bible prophecies are going to unfold. We all have our timelines and all this other stuff, and some of them are, look, I'm not, Hal Lindsey's book led a lot of people to the Lord, but I don't know that it was absolutely correct theologically or the way it looked at the scriptures and that type of thing. And it's been out for 56 years now, so it's like the world's changed a bit. Yep. So we need to kind of update our timelines and that type of thing and not be too rigid with them. Right. Because, look at what's happened over the last 5 years. Nobody called this, a lot of what's happened in the last 5 years. So we need to be a little bit humble about our timelines. So I suggested this Sunday. So the conventional wisdom in our community is that the seals only open in the 70th week and that the rider on the white horse is the Antichrist. And so I'm going to suggest something. This will probably get us all disinvited from every conference for the foreseeable future. But I stand by this is because, and by the way, I've had conversations. I won't identify the people, but this has been coming up in conversations for years. Like, are we really looking at the seals the right way? So the conventional wisdom is, well, the seals have to be after the beginning of the 70th week because they're wrath and we're not here for wrath and all. And so the conclusion on timing of certain events kind of dictates how you interpret everything. And I'm just saying is be humble enough to admit that maybe you don't have that correct. And I hope you're right, by the way, because it works out better for me. But what if we're not? How are we going to deal with this? And so I suggested Sunday, and I was talking to a Bible prophecy guy. You probably don't know who he is. And he sent me a note, and I will tell you it was very consistent with what I've been thinking is that the rider on the white horse may not be the Antichrist, but it may be the system being built that's going to let the Antichrist come to power. And I will say, so if that's true, what we saw the last week, I'm not ready to sit here dogmatically and say, hey, the white horse rider on the white horse is riding. Yeah. But it does talk about peace and prosperity and that type of thing and an economic system being built. And that was all over what Trump did in the Middle East last week. How much time did he mention economic prosperity? And he was kowtowing to the Qataris who in his first administration were evil Muslim Brotherhood people. I don't know. I don't mind that he talks to those people. What I mind is that he kind of slides. He doesn't speak the truth to them. That's my problem with it. Your comment.
That's an interesting thought. I had another thought. Again, I come from a Jewish background. I came to faith. I'm all about the scripture. I've heard it all, Bible prophecy, this and that. And my perspectives are changing. I'm not the dogmatic, it's going to be this way, and if you believe something else, you're wrong. I'm trying to remain teachable, John, so that there may be some other perspectives on things, and we don't know everything yet. So let's just kind of all take a step back and kind of learn. But let me tell you about the airplane. I used to work for the Boeing company.
Okay.
And, I'm also familiar just a little bit with Middle Eastern customs and manners, just a little. And this is along the lines of, and this is actually biblical, if you think about it. If somebody gives you a gift, how many times have you said, oh, thank you, but that's really too much. I don't really need that, or whatever. We try to be humble. We try to, you know what I've changed my perspective? If somebody gives me a gift, I take it and I look at the person and I thank them. And I'll tell you why. The blessing is being given. If you deny it or push back, you're taking the blessing away from the giver. Now, all that aside, the Qatar airplane, I've been in that factory. I've seen those planes being built up in Everett. Trump is playing chess 3D chess. Everybody else is playing checkers. He's a couple of moves ahead. By accepting that gift, he is saying, I want to create a relationship, and I accept it. And it's not going to him, it's going to the Air Force, right? He's trying, this is just my own take. It's like stacking up chips in the game. He's got things now that he can use. And this is, by receiving the gift, he's telling the people, let's play, let's talk. And maybe, just maybe, and maybe it's useless to even think this way. Maybe, just maybe, he'll find some moderate voices that will be able to quell things down in the Middle East, at least for the time being. And just thinking that there's a possibility here, by him accepting the gift, he's extending the branch of peace. I understand what you're saying, that there's a lot of money at stake, and we understand what Islam's end goal is. I get all that. But I'm just saying in the short term, I'm just wondering if there's another angle.
Well, I say that, and I think I said Sunday that, yeah, everybody's saying Trump's playing 3D or 4D or 5D chess or whatever. But I'm also saying there's a truth to something that needs to be addressed, and the fact that they were going to propose, that even was proposed that Idan Alexander, the last hostage that held American citizenship or U.S. passport, was going to be released and flown to Qatar, which has been funding this Hamas thing, their Muslim Brotherhood. When Hania was killed in Tehran, his funeral took place in the Great Mosque, the Grand Mosque of Qatar. And the Emir of Qatar was sitting right there on the front row as he was praised, and all this war talk went on in the eulogy or homily or whatever it was that they did for the speech they did for Hania. So I'm just saying is that I understand that and I get that, but I'm also saying is I'm also willing to presume and look at sort of the other side of this, like maybe we're not quite getting this right. And we always want to do things based on Middle Eastern customs, right? But we have customs too. The customs is we don't deal with terrorists, and so I'm not sure why one trumps the other. And that's
he did make this statement. I don't believe in forever enemies, and he used Japan and Germany as the example. We were bitterly at war with them during World War II, but after the war was over, we signed agreements and we moved on and became friends, and they've remained friends to this day for the most part. So,
and that's true, but there was a change. I haven't seen the change in this juggernaut called Islam, but I think this is all very, very prophetic. So I do think that someone going through the Middle East, making peace, trying to make peace, building economic prosperity and everything is kind of like, does this fit with any of those things we see in Revelation and Daniel and that type of thing? And right now I can't exclude the fact that what we're seeing is that this is a struggle I always have in Bible prophecy is, I look at what the pattern of what happened when Jesus came the first time. So Matthew writes these, his gospel, and he brings this thing out of Isaiah about a virgin shall conceive, right? And my question is this is how John Haller looks at it, is, so that was a prophecy about the first coming of Messiah. We knew the line of Messiah. We knew that before the second temple was destroyed, they had all the genealogical records at the temple. So they knew where this guy was going to come from. They knew who was the rightful heir to the throne of David, and that was Joseph. And then whoever was born to Joseph. But my question was, were there rabbis or running around Israel looking for pregnant virgins in the first century AD? I mean, really, because if this prophecy means something, it would be like, well, we'll just wait till there's a pregnant virgin, and then we'll know. But sometimes it's like after the fact, we can look back and say, okay, this is that which was prophesied. And so what I struggle with is, when we're in this transitory phase where things are going to be fulfilled, and when they start to be fulfilled, it's going to be like Jesus' first coming. Jesus' first coming, 60%, 59% actually, of the messianic prophecies about the first coming were fulfilled in the last week leading up to his crucifixion and resurrection. So in the last week leading up to his coming, or 60% of the prophecy is going to be fulfilled. And then how do we handle that, saying this is that which was prophesied?
What was that term? I heard you use it in a talk to that conference when we first
You
met.
listen? No,
I did. And I've used it. I've actually used it. I've quoted you, John, as my good friend John Heller likes to say.
Well, I quote myself very often.
Gradually
and then suddenly.
And I love that.
Yeah, that actually comes from a Hemingway book.
Does
I think
it?
it's The Sun Also Rises. Two characters are talking about, how did you go bankrupt? You know, and the guy goes, well, two ways. First gradually, then suddenly.
Suddenly.
And that's going to be, that's how I think that this Bible prophecy stuff is going to unfold. It's gradually, and then it's suddenly. And that happened at the first coming of Jesus. It's going to happen at the second coming in the same way. So I don't want to miss it, but I don't want to be too far out ahead of the facts, I guess, is the way that I'm looking at it.
I think that's a healthy way to look at it. I'm doing the same thing. Orno Fruchtenbaum is very well known, and I'm sure there's others that have said this.
Great book. Don't agree with some of his, like everything. You know, so I always make the disclaimer: I don't agree with everything that Fruchtenbaum says or writes. But his book on
Footsteps of the Messiah.
Footsteps of Messiah, and then also we sort of used his book as a guide in our church. We went through the life of Jesus chronologically.
Yeah, the Yeshua.
So he has a great tape series. I think it's like 28 hours of going. It's based on, I think, Robertson's chronological outline.
Harmony of the Gospels and all that. Fruchtenbaum has one of the greatest, and it's one of these. It's one of these. You should get a T-shirt or a bumper sticker, and I like the way he puts it, that we should be very aware of front page exegesis.
Right.
And so just because it's happening in the news and just because there's something in the Bible that might be related to it, it doesn't mean that today's events on the New York Times, if you read that or whatever, are actually fulfilling Bible prophecy. On the other hand, Israel's in the land. Half the Jewish people are living there. You can trace that back to hundreds of prophecies, I'm sure, that deal with the scattering of the Jews and then eventually the return of the Jews. So I think there's something to that. But there's also the preterists like Hank Hanegraaff that says none of this dealing with the Jews in Israel has any relevance at all. So,
and then I don't know if you've seen this. I probably shouldn't broach the subject, but I will. There's a new form of preterism out there called Satan's Little Season. Are you familiar with this?
Educate.
Well, so, preterists say Jesus came back in 70 AD. The Satan's Little Season people say Jesus came back and established his millennial kingdom for 1,000 years in 70 AD. And so Satan now has been released for his little season in Revelation 20 to deceive the nations.
Okay.
And what he's done is he's deceived everybody about what the history was of everything that happened during Jesus' millennial reign. And so now so they're saying, well, look at these cathedrals and all the stuff that was built, and we couldn't build them now. And I'm just telling you, it's preterism on steroids and I've seen preterists criticize this theory as well. But I'm getting emails from people saying, well, we're in Satan's little season. And I'm like, I'm sorry. Okay. Because anybody who doesn't adopt that, you're deceived. That, it immediately everybody points to you as being deceived. And I just don't like that approach. So we have different disagreements in eschatology and that type of thing and exactly how it's going to pay out. And with regard to newspaper exegesis, I agree with that, except to the extent that when it begins to happen, it will be on the front pages of the New York Times and the Washington Post. And so the question is, so you don't ignore the front pages, but you also don't say, and I agree with you, everybody says, well, this is that which was prophesied. There's too much what would we call it? Over-realized eschatology. Like everything proves my point. And I just don't think that we're there, but I think we're really pretty close.
It would appear so. And this full-on attack on international Jewry, it's I called Tom Hughes, I remember, after October 7th and then all the demonstrations in the streets all over the world. And I said, this seems to be pretty bad. He said it was worse than World War II. He says because it's international, and it's been happening. A guy named Jeffrey Goldberg, one of the editors of the Atlantic,
Sure,
wrote an article after the 2014 Gaza war. And this is like the fifth Gaza war in the last, 10, 12 years. And you can look that up on Wikipedia. It lists all the different deaths and all of that stuff, right? So actually, Wiki was fairly accurate on this one. And this thing about Gaza keeps coming up. And so in Europe, Goldboom wrote this article after watching these street battles happening, Muslims attacking Jews in the streets, the whole 9 yards, and all the demonstrations and all that all over the world. And he says that the inoculation of the Holocaust has worn off of Europe. And that was 10 years ago. And I would take that a step further and say now the inoculation of the Holocaust has worn off on the entire world. Because up until that point, the Jews were relatively left alone, relatively, they were protected, if you want to use that term. But the last 10 years, and it's intensifying now, it's open season on Jews wherever they are.
Right. Well, even Goldberg, I just looked up an article he wrote for, might have been a Philadelphia paper or Atlantic, back in 2014, saying in the Gaza war, this is 2014,
Yep.
The truth lies underground.
Yes. And yes.
It's almost prophetic. I mean, he's been very good on some issues. So that's why I read the Atlantic and the New York Times and that type of thing, because they do unknowingly, they do present some facts. They're not always skewed. They usually get around to the factual part. And so and I always want to know, I sort of follow, remember Cal Thomas?
Yeah.
He used to say, I get up every morning and I have my morning coffee and I read the Bible because I want to know what God's doing. And I read the New York Times and other newspapers because I want to know what the other side's doing. So I kind of feel that way. So I want to know what they're thinking and that type of thing. And, I'm not persuaded by them in any stretch of the imagination, but they actually do some good factual based expose articles every now and then. I mean, they really do.
What are you using for your primary news sources right now?
Well, I have a bookmark thing. So I have, I call it Front Pages, and it's probably 100 things. I have a subscription to a thing called PressDisplay.com, which gets me about a couple thousand newspapers around the world. So I kind of look at that. I do look at the front pages because that's kind of like, what's going on. That's sort of announcing everything. And I have a bunch of magazines. I do read like Foreign Affairs and Foreign Policy. And I know Foreign Affairs comes from the Council on Foreign Relations. And I know all about their orientation and that type of thing. But and then I have, excuse me, probably 100 bookmarks for think tanks, geopolitical analysis. I subscribe to magazines like The Economist, Spectator, some that are behind paywalls. I read the Times of London. I read a lot. I do look at the New York Times. I don't read the Washington Post much anymore. The subscription is fairly cheap, so I just maintain it. But, I don't know that I have, I will say, sort of where I get a lot of my ideas is X. My news feed on X gets me a wide variety. I don't know why I get all the anti-Semitic stuff you could ever hope for every day on X. And I don't know why. I don't know if somebody's trying to train me or what, but it's not working.
Yeah.
So keep bringing it my way. And sometimes you can find certain people on there, particularly in the anti-Israel crowd, that whatever they say, the opposite is probably true.
Yeah. I saw your name on the trackingbibleprophecy.org website. They picked you up and you're one of the links on that page. I don't know if you've seen that.
No.
It's a great, they'll publish like 100 stories a day, and they do their homework. They go all over the world and they got all kinds of stuff coming in from different places around the world. And you're there under I can't remember what the section is, but I think Lindsay's in there and
weirdos that kind of make a point every now and then.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I've been trying to tell Olivier to get in touch with these guys and get his link in there because they've got it's a great source of news. One of the things that I really like is they track earthquakes and volcanoes. That's always kind of fun to see.
Well, another area that needs to be tracked, and I have a friend who is, I would describe Messianic pastor, and I won't identify him, but in fact, you sent me a bunch of stuff this morning about the changes that are going on in the Earth magnetic field, and that's leading to a lot of disturbances. So some people say man's causing all the problems, and I'm saying it might be Earth changes. And this raises kind of an interesting thing. Like I object to everybody trying something miraculous happens and then there's natural explanations for it. I don't know that works. Now I know that you could say, well, the Earth changing magnetically, its magnetic field, the pole shifting and all this other stuff leading to disruptions, that's a natural explanation. But I'm like, yeah, but if it happens at the time that all this other stuff has happened and it's another part of the convergence, then it just shows kind of how like God's master design is in place.
Yeah.
That God set all this stuff in motion to happen when this geomagnetic shift was taking place. All these other things were going, and these will lead to some of the things we see in Revelation talking about happening. And I'm like, I don't know the answer to that right now. I don't have the answer. What I'm saying is that if that's the way it unfolds, it wouldn't surprise me because God's wound up the world to unfold just like this.
It's funny you mentioned this. I was thinking of my mother who died. In fact, this month has been her 40th year of her death, 1985. She was a manicurist, John, and had worked as a young girl after she got her manicuring license in the RKO studios up in Hollywood. And she had met and done the nails of a good number of these stars, including Judy Garland, and she had stories. She used to have a saying, and I love this saying, "You're seeing it right, but you're reading it wrong." And I've quoted that more times than I care to count in my sermons, because we'll generate an opinion on something, but are we really understanding what's behind it? And that might be a lot of what we're seeing today. Man is this whole climate movement and everything else. Man's destroying this and they're destroying that. And there may be some truth to a little bit of that. But in the background, God's going, I've got this. I'm changing everything. There's going to be massive changes to the earth. Fructbound talks about it in Footsteps. All the geophysical changes are going to happen to the earth during the millennium, leading up to the millennium and during the millennium. And then after that, Peter says the world's going to blow up. It'll be burned up and we're going to be a whole new heavens and earth. So there's a lot going on. God's at work. That's the main thing to all this. God's at work.
Right. I would, the follow up with the Satan's little season thing is, I don't know that Satan's little season is necessarily correct because there aren't evidences anywhere about the millennial reign of Christ that are existent. And now, if Jesus reigned 1,000 years and he started in 70 AD, now we're as far into the Satan's little season as the whole millennium. And I don't think that's what the scripture was saying. So I appreciate my friends looking at these things and that type of thing, but there's just some that really, I hear them and they're like fingernails on the chalk, on the chalkboard.
In thinking about that, I've read something somewhere. I can't remember who said it. If this is the millennial reign, I want my money back.
Right. Yeah. Well, so what they say is the dark ages were actually the millennial reign of Christ. When plagues and disease destroyed 30% of humanity.
Yeah.
But we don't, the other thing too is I don't think we have a really good grasp on what the millennium is exactly going to be like on Earth. I mean, are we going to have power plants? Because electricity is pretty important. And then you get into the burning of the weapons for 7 years and all that. Does that happen pre-millennial or not? I don't know the answer.
I'm doing a series. We're doing the book of Hebrews for the congregation now, but in between time, when our lead teacher, when he is off doing whatever he's doing and maybe on vacation or whatever, we slip in some little sermons on the millennium. I just did one a couple of weeks ago, and there's going to be some interesting changes to the earth, and those questions are embedded, but they're not in one place. It's not like you can turn to the millennial chapter in the book of Ezekiel. They're all over. So you've got to do a lot of harmony between old and new. And
it talks about believers ruling and reigning, but ruling and reigning what? I mean, will there be cars? Will there be, you understand what I'm saying is, will there be golf courses?
There's got to be golf courses.
Well, I joke with people. Now, I make this point not to be sacrilegious or anything like this, but I use it to make a point, because the point is that people will interpret scripture to prove their point. And so I say, you do know that there's golf in the Bible. You just got to get the Hebrew idioms right. And Psalm 23, it really means he gives me a good lie in a green pasture. And he leads me over still waters. So now that's not to denigrate scripture or the great meaning of that great passage, but it's kind of a double point that I make.
It's like people like to say baseball's in the Bible. You've heard that one, right?
In the beginning. Well, I almost said that at the beginning when you were talking about, the Bible and baseball and all this stuff. Yeah, in the beginning. Yeah. Anyway, so look, there's more I want to talk to you about, but I've got another interview coming up.
Oh, hey.
And so we'll finish this. But one thing I want to talk to you about the next time is one thing that I don't think we really talk about in the church enough is, what does this ultimate reconciliation of Jew and Christian look like? The wild olive branches and the natural branches are grafted into the same tree. What's that going to look like, and how do we facilitate that?
John, you know what? I can't wait to the next time. That's going to be a great discussion.
And that will get us a lot of hate mail.
Because there'll be a little love coming in. We'll get a little love there.
Yeah, but I just think that this is happening. So when I will tell you, I went to an Orthodox Zionist rabbi's home in Judea for Shabbat when I was there in Israel the last time 2 years ago. And I have to say, okay, so, I'm a Sunday, I go to church on Sunday and that type of thing, and I try to honor a day of rest and all that. But I have to say that the ritual biblical aspect of that was really one of the most profound and meaningful nights of my life. And we'll talk about that the next time, because I'm sitting there thinking about, because, he'll be right up front. This Jesus thing, just forget about it. Don't bring it up.
Yeah.
But how does this reconciliation thing work? Because I think this is a very big issue. And how do we facilitate it? Because we know it's going to happen. This is what we talk about. And I don't know, because I will say, I watched this this family's children engage with the scriptures in a way that I've never seen evangelical children engage with the scriptures. And that was kind of humbling.
There's a lot to be learned from that. And unfortunately, we have, I think in the evangelical community, have denigrated that relationship. And so there's a lot to learn in two different ways.
Well, we'll do that the next time. So Rob, if people want to follow you, where can they do that?
Well, I'm not on any social media right now. So if you just want to find out what we're doing and where I am, Ben David MJC, Messianic Jewish Congregation.org, BenDavidMJC.org. All of our teaching is up there online, and if you want to get a hold of me, you can contact me through the website.
Okay, great. And we will do this again. We've been talking about this for a couple of years now, I think. I think this is the first time we actually, did we do something with Olivier one time?
Yeah, we did once or twice with Olivier, and it was good. So, hey, by the way, I don't know if you can edit this out or if you want to keep it in, whatever it might be, but keep in touch with Olivier and contact David Tal today.
Okay.
You have David's information, don't you?
Yeah, I'm very troubled by what happened. Even before I knew it might have been Messianic believers who were killed in D.C., the thing bothered me in the first instance. It should bother everybody who's.
And I'll tell you, I'm troubled by what's going on at the college campuses, because that's the next generation of kids that they don't read. They don't have any ability to do any critical thinking. And that's a big concern for me. Big concern.
Yeah, my concern too is this relates to my roundtable on AI and everything. AI is taking over a lot of jobs, whether we want to admit it or not. And so what are these kids that don't have job prospects now going to do? Are they going to go into this protest thing? I mean, they're ripe for the picking.
Hard to argue,
in my view. So anyway, Rob, thanks a lot, and we'll follow up and do this again. So I'm going to turn off the recording and say goodbye to you on the other side. Hang on. So everybody, thanks for watching, and like, share, subscribe as usual. Follow us on social media. Appreciate it. Thanks, everybody.
Good. Thank you.